Flight Dreams, a Mark Manning mystery, Book 1. Author, Michael Kraft. Publisher, Open Road Integrated Media, New York. Narrator, Eric Ost. Wednesday, October 7th. 86 days, till deadline. Manning is driving north again from Chicago to Bluff Shores. When he phoned Father Matthew Carey yesterday to schedule an interview, the priest told him that he would be away from the parish most of Wednesday, but Manning was welcome to come talk a while after the 6:30 Mass. Manning glanced at the dashboard clock just as it flashes 7 a.m. Having pulled himself out of bed earlier than usual today, he doesn't feel quite awake. He hasn't even turned on the radio, riding in silence, immersed in uneasy thoughts. He hasn't set foot in a church for years, except in the line of duty, covering protests, for instance, or politicians' funerals. He turns onto St. Jerome's Parish property. The pine-flanked entry reminds him more of a country club than a church. In the distance, he can see the main building. It is round, a mammoth cylinder of light-colored brick with a shallow, conical roof that peaks, not with a steeple, but with a skylight. Its only windows are colored glass blocks randomly piercing the walls. Local critics have likened the building to a host of other structures ranging from a bull ring to a nuclear reactor. Researching the parish in the Journal's morgue yesterday, Manning learned that the church was built several years after the closing of the Second Vatican Council. Not because the old building needed replacement, but simply because the wealthy parishioners wanted to erect an edifice better suited to the new modes of worship decreed by their changing church. Manning drives past the school, the convent, the rectory, all of more traditional design than the church, and pulls his car into the parking lot near the hulking architectural oddity. Only a few other cars are parked there, perhaps a dozen, all in prime spaces, their bumpers almost touching the building. He reflexively checks his pockets for his notebook and Mont Blanc, then gets out of the car. The October monsoon is broken, if only briefly, and Manning is able to walk at leisure without darting for cover. His Cardigan Oxfords crunch the still wet gravel. Hungry, unseen birds gab noisily from the trees in the belated cloud-clogged dawn. As Manning enters the building's vestibule, an enormous sculpted bronze door closes silently behind him, hushing the birds. A ventilating system whispers from nowhere, and the carpeting underfoot heightens the pervasive sense of quiet. Pulling open one of the glass doors etched with an abstraction of the Trinity, he steps into the church proper. The vaulted room yawns before him, as if to suck him toward its center, where a monolithic slab of black marble serves as the altar. The overall effect is impressively dramatic, and Manning settles into a rear pew near the door to study the church's interior while waiting for the service to end. Manning tries to remember his last non-working church visit 10 years ago. No, 15. Could it possibly be that long since the gnawing suspicion became a firm reality for him? It has been that long since all the moral crises of his youth were washed clean. Suddenly gone were all the ethical dilemmas and doctrinal controversies and denominational nitpicking, all the guilt and doubts and complications that had cluttered his life. Years and years had passed since the realization formed in his brain and finally screamed to him with the voice of reason and logic and common sense. The voice that would be heard. That he simply no longer could believe in the existence of God. He's been free that long. Why, he wonders, did it not happen sooner? Santa Claus died for him when he was 6. The unwelcome knowledge that the benevolent old river of gifts was merely a myth came as a disappointment, of course, but he soon got over it, knowing even then, even that young, that a grasp of reality, seeing things the way they are, not simply as one would like them to be, was ultimately far more satisfying, more liberating than living a game, living a lie. Things fit. If Santa died so painlessly when Manning was 6, how did God manage to linger for another 20 years? How'd he do it? He had the forces of indoctrination and the momentum of blind faith on his side. That's how, when Manning was 6, he was deemed old enough to share the winking truth of the fairy tale that is Santa. He was also deemed old enough for recruitment into the larger fantasy. The big one, parochial school, first communion, altar boy, confirmation. He was set down a path that narrowed at every step. He was told by his mother, his teachers, and society at large that he would frolic in heaven if he believed, that he would burn in hell if he did not. Is it any wonder that his life was thwarted and ruled by mysticism for 20 years? The miracle is that he managed to see the light at all, that he managed to slow off the nonsense and to recognize the majesty and power of reason. Manning glances at the long liturgical banners swaying in the currents of air that circulate through the rafters. This church looks so different from those he knew in his youth. Do they all look like this now? His attention shifts to the service, which is nearing its end. Father Carey stands at the altar, vested in white. The congregation numbers less than 20 and is gathered in a circle around the altar with the priest. Manning guesses Father Carey's age to be near his own, around 40. True to Margaret O'Connor's description, he is indeed attractive, with curly brown hair and intense eyes of the same color. He has a commanding presence that seems to infatuate his parishioners. It was surely a coup for so young a man to be appointed pastor of a parish as large and affluent as St. Jerome's, and it was probably he who convinced Helena Carter to include the church in her will. He is undoubtedly a favorite among the hierarchy, someone to be watched, someone being groomed for bigger things. He's too polished, too slick, a manipulator, Manning tells himself. Manning watches as Carey clasps both hands of each of the faithful during the rite of peace, as he distributes chunks of consecrated bread and passes an earthen chalice of wine, as he finally instructs his flock, "Go in peace to love and serve the Lord." As the people begin leaving the sanctuary and the priest retreats to the sacristy, Manning rises and ambles down the aisle toward the front row of pews. A minute or two later, the priest appears again, dressed now in the traditional black suit and Roman collar. "Mark, sorry to keep you waiting." "Not at all, Father," Manning says, stepping forward to shake hands. "Please, call me Matt," the priest tells him, his manner businesslike, yet warmly personal, his handshake sure and deliberate. Manning wonders if the priest prolonged the handshake a moment longer than necessary. "Thanks, Matt. I appreciate your taking time to see me." They share a smile that seems to bond them, and Manning wonders if he has misjudged the man. "I'm glad we could arrange it," Carey says, while sitting in the front pew, motioning for Manning to join him. "It's been so long since Helena disappeared, we've all but given up hope. Lately, though, the papers are showing a renewed interest in the case. Tell me, are you onto something?" "I don't know yet. That's why I'm here. May I ask a few questions and take a few notes?" Manning opens his pad and unscrews the cap of his pen. "Of course." With a chummy tone of understatement, he adds, "I understand you're under a bit of pressure from your publisher." "Yeah, that's right." Manning laughs, though a bit uncomfortably. He asks the priest, "How did you happen to know about that?" "Oh, just a coincidence. I was at a social function with Archbishop Benedict on Saturday, and he had been to dinner Friday night with Nathan Kane. They go way back together. Committee work or something. Anyway, Mr. Kane told the Archbishop about your ultimatum, and the Archbishop told me." Manning pauses, watching the priest, then asks flatly, "Really?" "Yes." Father Carey laughs. "For heaven's sake, Mark, it's not a conspiracy. People at that level of power and influence all know each other. In fact, the Archbishop knew the Carters well. He played golf with Ridgely. Chances are Nathan Kane did too." Manning remembers the morgue photo of Kane with the Carters. He nods, deep in thought. Then he feels the priest's hand on his knee. "Mark, I'd like to help you, but I can tell you from the outset, I have no idea what happened to Helena Carter. I'd be a wealthy man if I did." "Do you care about wealth, Father?" asks Manning pointedly, using the clerical title. My remark was indiscreet, I admit, but since you ask, yes. I confess that certain earthly pleasures are highly appealing. He removes his hand from Manning's knee. I hasten to add, though, that an interest in money is not necessarily contrary to my priestly calling. I'm a diocesan priest, Mark. I'm not a member of a religious order, and have taken no vow of poverty. Wealth is not intrinsically evil. Indeed, much good can come from it. He gestures with both hands at the building that surrounds them, a testament to the benevolence of cash. Does such an attitude bother you? Hearing it from a priest? Oh, certainly not, Manning assures him. I only ask, the priest explains, because it bothered Helena deeply. We'd become close friends, but the issue of money eventually drove us apart. So, that was it, Manning says, underlining something in his notebook. I talked to Helena's sister, Margaret, a couple of days ago, and she said that you and Helena had a falling out. It's funny about money. After her husband died, her wealth began to prey on her. She didn't deserve her affluence. She married him for it, that kind of thing. It was during the course of some lengthy counseling sessions that the whole matter flared up. In an attempt to relieve her of these pointless anxieties, I confided in her my own materialistic leanings. She misinterpreted my remarks completely, and from that day forward I sensed her suspicion that I was after her legacy. It was very poor judgment on my part. It couldn't have done too much harm, Matt. Her will leaves the bulk of her fortune to the archdiocese. The priest stands and steps to the center of the sanctuary. I was shocked to learn it. Yes, we had discussed the possibility of a major bequest earlier. He places a hand on the altar. But I swear by the God I serve, Mark, I did not expect a dime for the church. Not after our money talk. I was convinced that it would all go to the society. What society? Margaret O'Connor told me that her sister had gotten interested in some conservative Catholic group. They sounded to me like a bunch of reactionaries. Precisely. They call themselves the Society for the Restoration of the Faith. But in church circles, they're simply known as the Society. The movement's seeds were sown back in the 60s at the Vatican Council itself. The whole upshot of Vatican II, of course, was reform. He whirls a hand above his head, indicating the bizarre architecture. But there was a sizable faction of the council that wanted the church to remain unchanged. There were even those who wanted to return to earlier ways. The handwriting was on the wall, though in favor of modernization, so most of the conservatives either stepped in line or just kept quiet. But not all of them. Carrie sits next to Manning again, explaining. A tiny group, spearheaded by the Belgian prelate Marcel Cardinal Levesque, became increasingly vocal in the debates, declaring the council's proposed changes heretical. An extremely serious charge, but the council's momentum would not be stopped, and I imagine you're familiar with the direction of mainstream Catholicism since then. Generally, says Manning. And Levesque? He didn't stop. He's ancient now, but he vigorously heads an ultra-conservative movement that's preaching schism. He's on a collision course with Rome, flirting with excommunication, but that would only make him a martyr to his cause, and I don't think Rome would risk it. So his numbers are growing, slowly. Manning rises thinking and strolls across the aisle to the next bank of pews. As a child, he was taught to genuflect whenever crossing the church's center, and even now he feels the subliminal tug of that training on his right knee, but he resisted. He turns to ask Father Carey, how did Helena Carter get interested in all this? There was a lot of publicity about the founding of a community in this country about 10 years ago. The movement had been predominantly European since its inception, so of little interest to the American church. The society caused quite a furor, though, when it announced that it had generated enough interest and secured sufficient funding, the source of which was never revealed, to acquire an abandoned mission town in the West. It would become their base of operation in America, reporting directly to Levesque. The community never really got off the ground, though, and it dropped out of the news entirely, even in church publications. Manning sits in the nearest pew, writing in his notebook. Facing the priest across the aisle, he asks, what do you know about the place? Not much. It's called Assumption, a little town that was built in the desert somewhere in the southwest. Arizona or New Mexico, I think. Miles from any city. It's secluded, and they want to keep it that way. There's a church and a school, and maybe 100 residents at most. Their civic as well as moral leader is the pastor of the church, Father James McMullen. He's a fine man, sincere in his beliefs, though, of course, I feel he's gone off the deep end with him. It so happens that I took classes from him in theology and doctrinal history while I was in the seminary, so I knew him well. Years later, we were all shocked to learn that he was packing up and leaving to oversee the founding of this reactionary community in the desert. It all sounded so eerie, like a cult or some oddball sect. Manning asked, Helena Carter sympathized with the society? Carrie exhales audibly. He rises and approaches the altar again, telling the reporter, I don't think she fully understood it as the anti-Rome doctrinal faction that it essentially is. Instead, she viewed it simply as the last stronghold of those sentimental aspects of Catholicism that many of us would like to hang on to. The Latin Mass, the meatless Fridays, the novenas and benedictions, Stations of the Cross, Saturdays in the confessional. All those things serve to set us apart, and by doing that to define us to ourselves in ways that were easily understood, guaranteeing salvation in no uncertain terms. And that can be very comforting. Some of our people have never recovered from the loss. Was Helena one of those people? Asked Manning. Did she seem inordinately anxious to return to the old ways? Do you think she'd be willing to run off and devote her life to the issue? No, says the priest. He returns from the altar and stands near the pew where Manning sits. Her preference for the old ways of the church never struck me as anything more than the wistful longings of a middle-aged widow who wanted to recapture part of the world she had known in her youth. Margaret told me that you wrote to Assumption to ask whether Helena might be there. Carrie sits next to Manning and explains. Sometime after the disappearance, Margaret came to me and told me she wondered whether Helena had gone to Assumption. She didn't know anything about the place, not even its name, but apparently Helena had spoken of it at home from time to time. Since the same thought had crossed my own mind, and since I'd known Father McMullen from school, I immediately wrote to him, asking if perhaps he had a new arrival who might be Helena. He soon wrote back, regretting that he could be of no help, assuring me that there was no such woman there. Manning asked bluntly, Would he lie to you? The priest laughs, then rivets Manning with a dead serious stare. It's unthinkable that Jim McMullen would lie or even stretch the truth for the sake of his personal gain. What about the sake of the community? The society? I see what you're driving at, Mark, but I know this man well enough to let the whole matter rest on his word. Manning turns a page of his notes and asks, How well do you know Margaret O'Connor? Margaret has never exhibited the depth of faith or the interest in church activities that her sister did. Other than Christmas and Easter, she rarely attends Mass. I like the woman. I just don't know her very well. I have no idea what happened to her faith. I guess she's just one of those who have gradually fallen away like so many. Like me. I fell away too, man. Manning tells him with a directness appropriate to the confessional. I wondered. Professional curiosity, but I'd never have asked. I know you wouldn't have, and I guess that you were wondering. I wanted you to know. Why? Asked the priest, leaning close to his knee, touching Manning's. So you would know, Manning says softly. So you would have a clear picture of the person you're dealing with. I don't expect you to sanction my views. I don't even want you to. That would imply a belief that I long ago abandoned. The priest leans closer still, his leg pressing against Manning's. What is it, Mark, that you don't believe in? The Pope, the Immaculate Conception, heaven, hell, Christ, the Trinity, God. Father Matthew, Carrie, may be testing waters that are not entirely theological. Manning isn't sure. His mind reels with a mix of conflicting emotions. Both attracted and repelled, he answers, God. That's the one I can't touch, says the priest, with a vanquished smile. His leg no longer presses against Manning's, but there is still a point between their knees where fibers of their trousers kiss like microscopic diodes, arcing hot energy. Any of the others, I might have offered logical arguments, or I might have slyly advised you to dismiss the smaller issues in favor of the larger. But you've already hit theological bedrock, so to speak, and I won't question your intelligence by asking how you've drawn your conclusion. So we disagree. Let's just say that. What's right for me may not be right for you. Sorry. Let's not. When it comes to a question of existence, does God exist? There can be only one answer, yes or no. Something either is or it isn't. That's irreducible. If you say there is a God and I say there isn't, one of us is wrong. It's not an issue that we can have both ways. By your own definition, a belief in God is a matter of faith. A faith that cannot demand proof and that condemns rational scrutiny. I hate to draw flat statements, but you're wrong, Matt, and I'm right. They sit in the front pew before the sanctuary, eyeing each other. With an unwavering gaze, the church is silent, except for the low rumble of a blower fan churning in distant ductwork. The banners waft lazily overhead. At last, the priest blinks and almost imperceptibly shifts his weight away from Manning. Their knees no longer touch. Seems we got sidetracked, says Manning with a quiet chuckle that further breaks the tension. We were talking about Margaret O'Connor. I saw her at the estate on Monday, as you know, and afterward I spent some time with Arthur Mendel, the houseman. He mentioned that Margaret once caused an uproar with her loose ways. I can't imagine what he meant, can you? The priest stands pressing his hands together, forming a little steeple. He touches his fingertips to his lips, paces a few steps away from Manning, then turns back to him. I want to help you get to the bottom of things, he says, but this isn't a subject for print. I wouldn't want to be quoted. All right. Manning caps his pen. Background only. What happened? Margaret O'Connor had a brief affair with Ridgely Carter, her sister's husband, right there at the estate. Jesus, says Manning, instantly wishing he could retract the expletive. Right under Helena's nose? No. Helena frequently traveled to cat shows, so Margaret and Ridgely had ample time to themselves. I get the impression that poor Margaret was, well, desperate, and Ridgely sort of took pity on her. Somehow, Helena got word of it after Ridgely died, understandably. She was plenty pissed. Surprised by the priest's candor, Manning asked, what did she do? Father Carey sits next to Manning again. She threatened Margaret. Talked about throwing her out of the house. Cutting her out of the will. Helena told me all these things, and I counseled her at length, urging her not to let anger, which was justified, fester into spite. Later, after she disappeared and her will was opened, it was gratifying to learn that Margaret would be generously cared for through a separate trust. Knowing Helena as well as I did, I should have known that her good nature would be predictably constant. On the other hand, says Manning, Margaret is full of surprises. When I spoke with her Monday, she said something that really threw me. She mentioned that when she and Helen were very young, there were twins growing up at home with them. It was the first I'd ever heard of them. Shaking his head in bemused disbelief, Father Carey says, Margaret is a sweet thing. Her sister's disappearance has been a source of profound stress. And I hate to say it, sometimes I wonder if she's entirely lucid. Helena and I had many long conversations about her childhood, and she never said anything about having brothers. She surely would have mentioned it. She surely must have, Manning tells himself. He told the priest about twins, yet the priest has spoken of brothers. Manning uncaps his pen and scratches on his pad. Father Matthew Carey lies. Later that morning, Bird caws and fidgets on the cross atop a very different church, a traditional little Gothic church that stands in defiance of a white desert sun. Nothing stirs in the scrubby, treeless landscape below. The town that renamed itself Assumption has taken refuge against the heat, the Bird responding to some arbitrary synapse within its gravel-sized brain, hops off the cross, swirls earthward round the spire, and then glides over the roofs of several nearby houses. All the houses in Assumption are in various states of disrepair. Most are wooden, some are stucco or adobe. but only one. The rectory, the priest's house, is made of brick. The bird lands on a weathered stone fanal, a pineapple that graces a brick pier to one side of the rectory's front stairs. The opposite pier has stood abandoned for years, denubbed of its pineapple by vandals, or by the ravages of heat, or simply by the passage of time. It's been longer than any of the current townspeople can remember. Inside, Father James McMullen sits at a rickety dining room table spread with paperwork that has outgrown its cramped office. He signs a document, stuffs it into an envelope, then tries to decide which pile of papers to tackle next, avoiding the tallest, the unpaid bills. It is late morning, almost lunchtime, he notes, and the house is quiet. A clock ticks on the mantel. Down the hall in the kitchen, his housekeeper is fussing with something. He wonders what Mrs. Weaver has in mind for lunch. Hoping it's not tuna salad. He's never liked those sandwiches. So quintessentially Catholic. Not since he was a boy, when he had to eat them every Friday at school. Though he still observes meatless Fridays with everyone else in Assumption. Mrs. Weaver is apt to foist tuna salad on him any day of the week, describing it as heart healthy, at least the way she fixes it, without mayonnaise, which makes it even worse. The stillness is broken by the phone ringing once in the kitchen. A few moments later, Mrs. Weaver appears in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Telephone, Father." She turns to walk back to the kitchen, then stops to tell him, "Lunch will be ready whenever you are." He rises from his chair slowly. Not that it's difficult for him, but he sometimes feels dizzy if he gets up too fast, and follows her down the hall. Mrs. Weaver resumes rinsing something in the kitchen sink. It's celery. Tuna salad, alas, is inevitable. The old black backlit wall phone is mounted near the doorway. Next to it, thumbtacked to the woodwork, are the last 3 pages of a church calendar. Little paper shreds, remnants of the past 9 months, sprout from its wire spiral. The priest picks up the receiver. "Good morning. This is Jim McMullen." Smiling, he listens to the caller, but has trouble hearing over the water gurgling in the sink. Yes, Mr. Manning. Where are you from?" "I'm a reporter for the Chicago Journal," says the voice over the phone. "And I'm working on a story about Helena Carter, the heiress who disappeared about 7 years ago. Perhaps you've heard of her." The priest's smile fades. "I'm aware of the incident, yes. In fact, I had some correspondence with the woman's home pastor shortly after her disappearance." Manning says, "I spoke with Father Carey just this morning, and he told me about that." "Then he must have also told you that I know nothing of her fate." "He did," confirms Manning. "But that was quite a while ago, and I couldn't help wondering if there had been any further developments in the intervening years." Father McMullen turns away from the housekeeper and huddles the phone into his shoulder. With anger mounting in his voice, he asks Manning, "Why would I conceal any knowledge of this woman's whereabouts? The terms of her will are well known. Her fortune will go to the mainstream church. What would be my motive for deception?" Mrs. Weaver turns off the water and is poised to begin chopping celery. Listening, she doesn't move. The dried out linoleum pops under the shifting weight of her feet. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.